Hi there. We're continuing our study of John's epistles, entering into his second epistle now, probably and arguably one of the shortest books in the whole of the Bible. I want to remind you before we get to the actual text of this letter that John's gospel paints a picture of our advantage and access to the salvation story through Christ and how we align ourselves back in the good graces of God by accepting the grace and love that He's extended toward us. The epistles refer to how we live in this new grace position and how we seek to transform our current condition. That is, how we deal with the baggage we've brought to the faith, how we deal with our historical and repetitive behavioral patterns, how we develop a reflective practice in order to see ourselves better aligned with the purposes of God. And this same person writing in what we know as the book of the Revelation, or Revelation of John the Divine, talks about the end result, the mystery of our future. In 1 John, the five chapters of the first letter, he writes this generic encouragement to the church that's dispersed in the known area and encourages them to close their ears or shut down their thinking and their involvement in a perpetuating lie in the vicinity. And the lie was something we now define as Gnosticism, but one of the tenets of this lie was that Christ, the person, was not actually fully human. That there was something about Jesus that differentiated him from the rest of humankind. Well, this is, as we pointed out over the last 5 or 6 weeks, this is a subtle lie, but one that, when it is deconstructed, has no merit, but secondly, when it's deconstructed, it undermines the whole of the gospel story. It undermines the whole of the plan of salvation. If Christ had not come fully as human, then he would not know temptation as we know it. Then he would not know what it was like to live with the screams of the flesh, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, as John wrote in the second chapter of his first epistle. He wouldn't know that. And if he didn't know that, then how could he possibly identify with us, and how could we possibly identify with him? So this lie that was being perpetrated, he wrote and challenged in 1 John as actually being from the Antichrist, the spirit of the lie that is at war with our souls. So we need to keep that in mind, because the 3 letters all have bearing in the same message. This second letter, written, as the text says, to the elect lady and her children, has in and of itself caused much confusion and struggle in the church. First, it's the only epistle in the New Testament that's actually identified as being written to a woman. And some theologians have argued because it was apparently written to a woman and women were not in leadership in the church, it was just a metaphor for the church. And the church, because the church has often been referred to as the bride of Christ, those who would want to distance themselves from female leadership have argued that this letter was really to the church as a whole. There are other more historical theologians, though, who suggest that indeed this letter was written to a leader in the church. And it was a woman, possibly even Martha of Bethany, Mary's sister, who was now living in the vicinity. That it was written to someone of significant influence, someone who was probably of well-means, probably financially quite solvent and helping to keep the church going. And somebody that had enough influence that John felt it was time to write very specifically to her. Sometimes the strategic plan for a good business or the strategic plan for the extension of the kingdom of God is to identify the genuine influencers. Oh, not those who call themselves leaders, because often those who even have been raised to leadership aren't the ones who actually sway the crowd. The key is to find the natural leaders in the community. And if you can find those natural leaders and can get them on board with you, then the 80% who like to follow will enthusiastically follow. And it is perceived, and I think with great merit, that this elect lady and her children was probably, as I've just suggested, a very influential woman in the vicinity who was able not only to gather community, probably had a lot of physical, biological children, but was also influencing a large number of the children of God in the vicinity. The suggestion is that it was in the vicinity of Ephesus, because John arguably wrote his letter from the city of Ephesus. So if he's writing from Ephesus, then the letter is going to be distributed to the churches just within that area that were being challenged with this lie. Now, again, interestingly, and another sort of bit of anecdotal trivia for you, there are only two places in the New Testament where the word Antichrist is used, and it's in 1 John and in 2 John, because it is the burden weighed on John the author's heart was that this lie was so damaging to the gospel, excuse me, and to the people of God, that the only place it could possibly have been birthed was from the pit itself, from the abode of Satan. Now, we recognize that there are sins that come from the flesh, and there are sins that come from the spirit of this age, and there are sins that come from Satan, which is why in our baptismal covenant we are asked to renounce the world, the flesh, and the devil. Because the things that are of the flesh, although Satan just needs to turn the volume of those things up, he really doesn't need to instigate them. Because your flesh screams at you every day in any number of ways. And if the volume is too loud, then it shuts out the other voices in your life. Satan doesn't have to instigate a new temptation in those areas for you. He's already got you. They're already there. Nor does Satan need to instigate the temptations in the world or the cosmos, the peer pressure that we experience in our life, the subtleties of our world. Beth Moore, the Southern Baptist Bible teacher, said recently that the sin that we may be facing judgment for is not our personal sin, but the sin of using God's word and God himself to justify our bad behavior. That's not from Satan either. We are just a people who have mastered the ability to justify bad behavior. My goodness, can we do it? And Satan doesn't have to instigate that. He just needs to turn the volume up. Make it sound more appealing. Make it sound like it's the cool thing to do. Make it sound like that this is the way forward, because the old is antiquated and out of touch with reality. But Satan does initiate in areas where the world and the flesh may not have the creativity. And in this particular case, and often, it is satanic or antichrist spirits that initiate theological lies that help undermine the very truth of the gospel. You see, this biblical text, this letter, really challenges us to be people who are not only believing the truth, but we're living our lives according to the truth. And the distinction is made pretty clearly. Let me just take 2 steps back and say the first 6 verses of this epistle have to do with commending this woman, or this head of the house. Verse 7 and following have to do with the challenge and the encouragement. And in this particular case, the challenge is to be cautious of his words, the deceivers who have gone out into the world, those who do not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh. So they're deceivers. And he cautions the woman in verse 8 to be on your guard so that you do not lose. So the expectation is, or the interpretation is, do not lose what we have worked for. So the deceiver comes then to steal. Oh, John said this in his gospel, 10th chapter. He said, the thief comes in order to steal, kill, and destroy. But I've come that you may have life in all of its abundance. So it seems that the lie here, or the deception here, is to believe in a Christ other than who Christ really is, which ultimately will destroy our lives. Let me put it to you this way. If the truth is 2 + 2 = 4, and we know that to be true, and we live our lives according to that truth, we establish our monetary system, or most everything we do, based on these mathematical truths. If we know this to be true, then it makes a difference in the whole of our life. But if someone comes along and tries to convince us that 2 + 2 does not equal 4 anymore, but that 2 + 2 equals something else, firstly, it's going to make us stand out against the crowd. Okay, and that sometimes is appealing to us. But foundationally, it challenges the basis upon which we live our lives. I live my life based on the truth of the law of gravity. And I don't try to do things foolishly because I don't believe the law of gravity. I may not understand the law of gravity. I may not know that the falling speed of an object is, 32 feet per second or something like that. I don't have to understand it, but I know it to be true, and so I fashion my life around it. Now, a deceiver may want to try to convince me that the law of gravity is not true. And with the right flowery words, with some smoke and mirrors, with some fancy handwork, a charlatan may be able to do that. We know that there are conspiracy theorists who have made a substantial part of the world believe that the Holocaust did not really exist. There are conspiracy theorists who've tried to convince a good part of the world, and many in America, that COVID-19 is not really a risk to your health. There are always charlatans who try to lead us astray. And it was charlatans in the vicinity of Ephesus, to whom John was writing between the years 85 and 95 AD, that were trying to convince the people there that this was not really true, that he didn't need to come in the flesh. Well, the ripple effect of that, as we found in 1 John, was not believing something about Christ to be concretely true profoundly changes how we live our lives. So the second half of this epistle, 7 through 13, encourages the readers to recognize the necessity of believing truth, the necessity of living our lives according to that truth. And what is the ultimate foundation of that, or the ultimate evidence of that, is that our lives are being formed and fashioned by the one who loved us, and we are ever increasingly learning to love. The whole of the epistle is directed to this very thinking. Now, the challenge, of course, is that we need to be, firstly, reflective enough to come to grips with what it is we believe. Because we have also been empowered by our culture to suggest or to begin to believe the suggestion that truth is a moving target. You have heard it said, I know you have, and someone asked me this last week in one of our small studies. If something is true for you, is it necessarily true for me? Yes. There are foundational truths about God that are the benchmark, standard. They are true for all of us. There are other variables. And the danger is, and I realize where this question came from, I suggested in last week's video that great passage in James, for you to know something is wrong and do it is sin, which suggests that something may be sinful for me but not for you. And I'm going to argue that in some cases that is true. In some cases, given who I am and what I bring to the faith, some behavioral patterns for me are not healthy and lead me to be alienated from the God who loves me. Those same patterns may not exist in your life and may not prove to be problematic. And there are a multitude of examples of that we can talk about if you're interested. But the real question is, are there foundational truths that we cannot compromise on? And I'm going to say to you today, a definitive yes, there are foundational truths. And some of those truths are evidenced in how we think about Jesus. We believe that Christ did come in the flesh, born of a virgin, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead and was buried, and he rose again on the third day. No question about it. As soon as we begin to entertain thoughts that maybe he really wasn't born of a virgin, how could that be? Maybe as soon as we begin to entertain thoughts, raised from the dead? Could he really actually been raised? Maybe it was a spiritual resurrection. Maybe he really didn't die. Maybe it was groupthink. As soon as we begin to think that, we're deviating from the truth of the law of gravity. And the next thing you know, we could possibly be attempting to jump off high mountain cliffs without a parachute or without wings. That was what was happening in Ephesus, in the vicinity of Ephesus. There were a group of people who were beginning to entertain the possibilities of life. So what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve began to entertain a question about a foundational truth? The foundational truth was that God commanded the disciples that God commanded Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of the good knowledge of good and evil. As soon as they began to question, what was the question? Satan, there's that one in the form of a snake. Satan comes and says, did God really say? That's what was happening to the people to whom John was writing. He was writing them, and Satan was coming among this group, and he was saying, is this really true? As soon as we begin to entertain that, as Adam and Eve, did God really say? That empowered them to ask the question. And as soon as they began to ask the question, that they began to explore other answers. And as soon as they began to explore other answers, they decided that the fruit was good to eat, and that led them to an expulsion from the kingdom. That's precisely what was happening in Ephesus. That is also what happens in 2020. In fact, in the last 30 or 40 years, there have been many significantly influential theologians who have risked the health of the Christian community by simply asking some really serious questions about foundational truths. We say Sunday after Sunday, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. End of story. It is the foundational truth. We believe it. And as soon as we start saying maybe Christ didn't really die, maybe he wasn't really buried, or maybe he's not really coming again, as soon as we start saying that and entertaining that as a possibility of truth, we risk finding ourselves among those children referred to in this epistle, who are beginning to sway or move from the truth. Some of your children, verse 4, some of your children are walking in truth, just as we have been commanded by the Father. But there are those among you who are no longer walking by the truth. So the challenge for us in this biblical text is to firstly acknowledge that we may be at risk of being deceived, and we have to be courageous enough to have the filter of biblical truth in front of us to say, does this qualify as truth, or is it a deception? Is it an error that people are trying to pull the wool over my eyes? The enemy's trying to deceive me so that ultimately the enemy will steal what we have. There are some tragic stories of people who, because they just wanted to be well-liked, compromised themselves and compromised what they believe, and allowed what was the precious gift, that pearl of great price that was given to them, to be pulled away. It's amazingly sad and disappointed. And what God wants for us is what John wanted for the people who were receiving this letter, that they may participate fully in God. And they participate fully in God by recognizing and accepting the truths that have been given them, and by then living into those truths by loving their God and by loving one another. He says, don't trust anyone who tries to add to this text. This is a message that John has repeated a number of times, but at the very end of the book of the Revelation, he says the same thing. He says, don't trust anyone who tries to add to this book. Don't trust anyone who tries to explain away with more words what already exists to be true. On the other hand, welcome everyone enthusiastically who abides this text. Now, there's a lot more in 2 John than just that, and we're going to unpack those things next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, in our regular Bible study, to which I encourage you to come and participate. Somewhere else in this document, you're going to find the links to those Zoom conferences. But between now and then, ask yourself this question. Ask yourself how easily it is for you to be deceived. Are you grounded like the person who built his house on the rock? Are you grounded enough in the truth that no matter how strong the wind or how fancy words the charlatan has, that you're not going to be moved from that foundation? Or is your faith still that of an infant and need to be nourished in the truth, so that you will not risk being deceived and ultimately destroyed? I love being able to do this. I hope this video has made some sense, and I look forward to seeing you next week.